Andrew, if you could explain the prosecution strategy of having Susan Hoffinger question Daniels.
Yeah, so I'm not surprised. I would also think that we may see Susan Eckles finally doing something in the case on the defense side. You know, I've said this repeatedly. She is on the defense side. She is the one lawyer there who is actually an experienced defense lawyer. The other two gentlemen are experienced former prosecutors, but very little defense experience. And that is typical in a story like this, with a witness like this, that you might want to have a woman do the direct and you might want to have a woman do the cross-examination. I'm not saying I'm not trying to endorse that or not endorse it. I'm just saying that that is a common strategy for something of this nature, to have a woman do the direct of this woman, and the same thing for the cross. It may be for social expectations or what juries may expect, but I do think that we will see essentially the Susans both taking, I think, an active role in connection with this particular witness.
Andrew, let me take you back into the document, because they're talking about this second time that she met him. This is again at the vodka event, and I'm reading here. And she's asked how long she stayed, and she said a couple of hours, 2 hours tops. What did he say, meaning Mr. Trump, when you were leaving? That he wanted to get together again. I miss you, he said. You know, the usual. This is not a direct quote, but the general idea of what she testified to. And then she basically says, to use 2024 parlance, she ghosted him. He called her multiple times. She realized she wasn't going to get on The Celebrity Apprentice. She didn't want to have anything else to do with him. But when she talks about this, and she says this, that he was still pursuing her, earlier in her testimony, she talks about the fact that she asked him about his wife, and they had only been married a year, and he said, you know, basically not to worry about it because they didn't even sleep in the same room. And then he compared her in some way to apparently his daughter Ivanka, saying that she reminded him of his daughter. And the whole idea that when she went to what she thought was a dinner, he came out in silk or satin pajamas. I say all of that, Andrew, because I'm wondering how much of this is in a way kind of a reverse character witness, that what she's really communicating to jurors is maybe that this isn't such a good guy, maybe not somebody to be trusted.
You know, I think all of that is true, but I think that you're going to see the prosecution be very careful and delicate about how they use this in summation, and try and play it completely by the book to say, look, we needed to introduce this, but he's not on trial because of whether you like him or dislike him. You know, all of the tawdriness is that, you know what, you can be tawdry and not a criminal. You can be a tawdry and we haven't proved our case beyond a reasonable doubt. I think they're going to try and distance themselves from that, as they should. And, you know, there's a reason that this is put on that's sort of very divorced from the way we may all be looking at it in terms of the sort of political lens, small p political lens of sort of how it plays in terms of what it says about the former president and the nature of these allegations. But in terms of the case, there's a very strict way in which there's relevance to this. I should point out that her story and what she's saying does have all these sort of corroborative details. As Vaughn was saying, you know, Rona Graff says that she believes she saw her. She does have Keith Schilling's, the bodyguard's information in her own telephone that was introduced. We saw records that the former president had Stormy Daniels' information in his contacts that was put there by Rona Graff. I mean, there are these details, including she is talking about specific people who were there at the time. And that's usually not the kind of thing you would say if you thought it could be disproved, that those people would hop on the stand and say that's not true. So there, you know, there's a lot of corroboration around the edges of her story and the fact that they knew each other, including, of course, the very famous picture of the two of them. So you know, there will be substantial reason to think and credit her. Of course, the jury is also entitled to just consider her credibility. And you can be sure on cross-examination by Susan Necheles, if she does it, that she's, her credibility will be attacked in terms of her motive or trying to make money off of this story, and various other things about her will be tested, as is the defense right, and as they should be doing, will be testing her credibility.
How tough would you be on her if you were doing the cross? From what we're hearing, at least inside the courtroom, the jurors are not reacting. Whatever they're thinking, whatever they're feeling, they seem to be holding it pretty close to the vest.
Well, that's appropriate. I mean, I've been on a jury, and, we all try to be very, very dispassionate. And also you're told to not really think and not think about sort of how you want to deliberate at the end until the end. In other words, wait for all the evidence before you start doing that. I think that I could see the cross being fairly tough because the defense position is that she's lying. So if you think that she is lying in order to make money or for whatever other reason, you can imagine her being tough, and that's where you may decide that a woman would be better to do that kind of cross-examination with respect to a woman, so it doesn't look like bullying and people's sexual stereotypes don't, get played differently by how the cross works. But I think I could see.
But can I just go back for a second, because you made the point about all the corroborating evidence, and in fact, she has told a pretty consistent version of this story for more than a dozen years now. So do you think that this is the defense not believing her story, or the defense being instructed by the client to try to disprove her story? Because ultimately, whether they had sex or not, as has been pointed out multiple times, doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think this is one where I think there's a confluence where I think that I could see the defense strategy and Donald Trump's own sort of political and personal views actually aligning. We've talked about it at times. Those are disparate, and sometimes what he might want to do politically would not be useful in court. But I think here, I think that there is an overlap. And so I think the defense strategy legitimately could be to do a hard cross-examination and to really try and cast doubt on why she's doing this, and to point out that, this was, even under her story, it's just a one-night stand that she's really trying to make a lot of money and publicity over. And that, that's the kind of thing that jurors could react to and in some ways not think terribly favorably of the defendant or of her. And at the end of the day, when I've been summing up, in whether I'm a prosecutor or a defense lawyer, I'm usually telling the jury whether you like the witnesses personally is not the issue. It's really about credibility and assessing the whole story and all of the evidence. It's not about who you want to have dinner with. And so sometimes I think that we sort of overanalyze how likable a witness is. Some of the best witnesses I've seen are really not likable at all, but are very, very credible.